Alexander the Great, the emperor of the largest empire at the time, lay dying in his bed, surrounded by his generals and friends who followed him throughout his campaigns. Some were saddened by the king's demise, and some were struck with a sense of ambition. On his deathbed, heirless Alexander was asked, "Who shall have the empire?" And he replied, "To the strongest." Thus, his newly found empire, stretching from the Balkans in Europe to modern-day Pakistan in South Asia, would become a cesspool of civil war, assassination, and uprisings. The many men who were given the opportunity to carve up Alexander's empire for themselves were called the Diadochi. In Greek, they would be referred to as the Diadochoi. Following Alexander's death, the Diadochi were now compelled to reach a consensus about the future of the succession of the empire. Generals had to make a decision to support either Alexander's unborn child or Alexander's half-brother, Philip Aridaeus, who was mentally disabled. They came to the conclusion that Perdiccas, who was one of the highly regarded noble generals of Alexander, would become the regent of the empire until Alexander's son Alexander IV was mature enough to claim his father's throne. However, this process was not without intrigue or drama, as an army captain staged a brief uprising in support of Philip Aridaeus over Alexander IV. Some in the army, disgruntled that no share in the deliberation had been granted to them, promptly decided to proclaim Aridaeus as their new king and appointed that he should be called Philip after his father. These proceedings were reported to Perdiccas, who quickly dispatched two of his officers, Attalus and Meleager, to quell the excitement. But they, hoping for power for themselves by flattering the multitude, neglected their commission and took part with the soldiers. The insurrection soon gathered strength when it once began to have a head and regular management. The disgruntled soldiers rushed into the palace with a resolution to cut the cavalry of Perdiccas to pieces. But the cavalry, hearing of their approach, retreated in haste from the city, and after pitching their camp. Attalus dispatched some of his men to assassinate Perdiccas, but the assassins feared to go near him, though he freely invited them to approach, and such was the resolution of Perdiccas that he went of his own accord to the rebellious soldiers, and, summoning them to an assembly, represented to them the atrocity of their conduct, admonishing them to consider against whom they had taken arms, that they were not Persians but Macedonians, not enemies but their own countrymen, most of them their kinsmen, but certainly all of them their fellow soldiers, sharers of the same camp and of the same dangers, that they would present a striking spectacle to their enemies, who would rejoice at the mutual slaughter of those by whose arms they grieved at having been conquered, and that they would atone with their own blood to the manes of their slaughtered adversaries. Perdiccas, having enforced these arguments with eloquence, produced such an effect upon the infantry that his admonitions were obeyed, and he was unanimously chosen general. A portion of the empire was reserved for Alexander's son, if a son should be born. However, Aridaeus would be crowned as king for the time being. The rebellious captains were later slain. Meanwhile, Alexander's wife, Roxanne, mother of Alexander IV, decided to secure her son's succession by poisoning any other wives or mistresses Alexander had. She would also have some women thrown down a well. Ultimately, after their meeting, the commanders decided to split the kingdom among themselves, despite initially agreeing to Perdiccas' idea of him being the regent. Perdiccas was not given a satrapy or a region. Instead, he was made the treasury's guardian and the head of the army. The idea to bring the empire back together under one leader would never be realized. In the following wars of Diadochi, the individual commanders and their offspring would fight one another for another 30 years. On another note, Alexander's corpse was left unattended for days on end. But one man understood its importance. Ptolemy, now governor and pharaoh of Egypt, had plans of his own to solidify his legitimacy among the other Diadochi. He would plan a heist for the ages. However, Perdiccas had control over it and decided for Alexander to be buried in Macedon. The corpse was embalmed and placed in a sarcophagus so that it would be escorted to Aegae, his home of Macedon, to which he had not returned ever since he left for his life's journey. Alexander's remains were placed in an elaborate and decorated carriage made by skilled craftsmen, drawn by 64 mules and built in the shape of a Greek temple. Such a carriage was being escorted and defended by one of Perdiccas's lieutenants. The carriage would have to traverse through the arid deserts of Mesopotamia without any hurdles. Throughout the journey, Ptolemy would be routinely informed by his many informants and scouts as he waited for his chance to strike. After an arduous journey through the desert, the escort party had reached the outskirts of Damascus, and upon hearing the news, Ptolemy decided it was best then to strike. He managed to convince the men tasked with taking Alexander to Macedon that Alexander himself wanted to be buried in Egypt, and also by bribing them with gold. Thus, Alexander's corpse would change directions to Memphis, the very place where he was acclaimed as a god by the Egyptian priests. Upon receiving the news of the heist, Perdiccas was furious. After the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, Ariarathes continued his resistance against the Macedonians, ruling concomitantly as an Achaemenid remnant and a precursor to the Kingdom of Cappadocia. However, in 323 BC, Eumenes, one of Alexander's secretaries, received ownership of Cappadocia after Alexander's death, but because Alexander had not thoroughly subjugated Cappadocia, he was unable to drive Ariarathes out and solidify his position. The fact that Eumenes was unable to win the allegiance of the other Macedonian satraps made the situation harder. He then resorted to Perdiccas, who had agreed to help Eumenes seize Ariarathes' province in order to win over more allegiant governors. Perdiccas, the regal court, and the battle-tested royal Macedonian army reached Cappadocia in the summer of 322 BC. It appears that Ariarathes, rumored to be exceedingly wealthy, gathered a force made up of locals and mercenaries to fight Perdiccas, but was unsuccessful and was taken prisoner. In 322 BC, Perdiccas broke off his engagement with Nicaea, daughter of Antipater, because Olympias offered him the hand of Cleopatra, a sister of Alexander the Great. This action destroyed the alliance between Perdiccas and Antipater, and led Antipater to turn on Perdiccas. Antipater would be joined by Craterus, Antigonus, and Ptolemy to join together in a civil war against Perdiccas, known as the First War of the Diadochi. Though the actual outbreak of war was triggered earlier by Ptolemy's theft of Alexander's body and diversion of it to Egypt. Because of this, a coalition of other successors formed against him. An army under Craterus was sent to Asia to confront Perdiccas and his allies. Perdiccas sent Eumenes and Neoptolemus with an army to the Hellespont to prevent Craterus from crossing into Asia. Neoptolemus, jealous of Eumenes, deserted with a few hundred horses and joined forces with Craterus. Eumenes faced a huge challenge. His officer Neoptolemus, the turncoat, had fled to his enemies and convinced them to pursue Eumenes with some of their forces. Neoptolemus helped lead this expedition against Eumenes, but most ominous was its ultimate command by Craterus, a paragon of military virtue well liked by the Macedonian army. 2 years earlier, Craterus's forces crushed an Athenian-led revolt threatening Macedonia at the Battle of Cranon. He had fought in the highlands of Aetolia, and he had also made his mark at Delphi, the notice board of the ancient world, commissioning a statue of himself there alongside Alexander the Great. Eumenes faced a daunting task if he was to overcome Craterus, but his strategy proved highly effective. Fearing mass desertion, he concealed the name of Craterus from his army. He did not even tell his highest subordinates. Instead, writes Plutarch, he gave out the word, then, that Neoptolemus was once more coming against him with Pigres. Eumenes did not stop there. He refused heralds from the enemy camp that threatened the deception. He guided his army along unused paths, and he maintained up-to-date intelligence over his foes' movements. His army, meanwhile, was kept in the dark. This was a remarkable deception, especially when you consider that Eumenes' army numbered some 28,000 men. Both sides stationed their phalanx in the center and cavalry on the wings. The phalanxes engaged, and a stiff fight ensued, characteristic of meetings of two Macedonian phalanxes. When Craterus came to battle with Eumenes, his soldiers still had a false impression of who they faced. They did not break, and they did not falter. Craterus, standing distinct upon his horse, wearing ornate armor and a traditional Causia cap, was lured into the type of fight Eumenes had desperately desired. Confident that the enemy would desert in droves as soon as they saw his standout figure, Craterus advanced too far ahead of his main army with his mounted squadrons. With his cavalry, he became isolated. His enemy, unaware that they faced Craterus, did not come to him with a rush, arms and all, as Neoptolemus had counseled. Instead, the general cursed the air as he saw large squadrons of the Asian cavalry charge at full speed towards him. Nonetheless, Craterus countercharged. His armor made him a target. Once the lines clashed, enemy horsemen attacked him again and again. Though he fought with a courage worthy of his reputation, the enemy overwhelmed him. Eumenes went on to win the battle, killing his most hated foe, Neoptolemus, in the process in one of the most graphically described duels in the whole of antiquity. Their horses dashed together with the violence of colliding triremes, and dropping the reins, they clutched one another with their hands, each trying to tear off the other's helmet and strip the breastplate from his shoulders. While they were struggling, their horses ran from under them, and they fell to the ground. Following this victory, Eumenes was mourning his former friend's loss and taking great pains to see that future records of the battle pinned the blame primarily on Neoptolemus and his rotten advice. Eumenes is portrayed as a reluctant victor, Craterus the victim of a crooked adjutant's misguided counsel. Craterus's death in battle against Eumenes was one of the most shocking events of the post-Alexander world. No one had anticipated the defeat of Eumenes' ragtag force to pose a serious challenge. The most famous general alive should have crushed an enemy with such inferior military experience. Thank you for watching this video. In the next video about the Diadochi Wars, Eumenes will clash with Antigonus, and Perdiccas will lead an expedition into Egypt. Subscribe to not miss out on that video.